So my name is Mogens Laerke. I'm at the Maison Française in Oxford, and I'm the convener generally of this seminar on science and the public sphere that we've been running at the Maison for a while now, on all kinds of topics, having basically just to do with the interface between the sciences, all kinds of sciences, human sciences, art sciences, so on and so forth, social sciences, with the public sphere. For this particular session, I've asked Thomas Lacroix, who's also a fellow here at the Maison Française, to organize a session on his speciality, which is in migration studies. And I think with that, I'll just give the word to Thomas so he can present our speakers today.
Right. Thank you, Mogens. Right. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this specific webinar on the ethics of media coverage of migration. And it's been a hot and very hotly debated issue, because years after years in various reports we have seen and it's been highlighted the relatively negative tonality with which migration has been covered by media in Europe. I just mentioned the report in 2020 of the European Journalists Organization, which shows that migrants and refugees are mainly depicted as groups rather than as individuals. Males are overrepresented in media coverage of migrants and refugees, and this is absolutely very important, with a very low proportion of migration and refugees who are quoted in these articles. So the migrants and refugees tend to be voiceless in their own representations. And yet, we know that the media are absolutely crucial because they represent the primary source of information about migration and migrants, especially in areas, in European areas with little or no immigration. And we observe a strong correlation between anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-immigrant voting as well, and the low representation of the low presence of immigrant settlement. So the ethics of this media coverage is absolutely crucial. And so I'm very pleased here to welcome our two speakers today to address this issue. And first of all, Rob McNeil, who is the Deputy Director and Head of Media and Communication at the Migration Observatory here in Oxford. And Rob is also a founding member of this Migration Observatory. You also participate in Oxford University and COMPAS research project, and your expertise focuses on the social environment from which this news story and narratives about migration and migrants emerge. You work on the way media debates affects migration policies and decisions, and also the information gaps which affect the ways these issues are discussed. You're not only a researcher, you're also a former journalist, so you have an insider view. You work for a range of publications, including the Evening Standard, Daily Mirror, the Sunday Mirror, Red, Time Out, and BBC Wildlife. So Rob will be our first speaker, and then I will introduce at a later stage Catherine Guilyardi when she will present a paper. So Rob, I give you.
Thank you very much. Now, the first thing I need to check is whether or not we are actually sharing the screen. Is that's actually happening at the moment? Is it what we're seeing over here is what's on the screen or not? I don't really understand how this.
We don't see anything at the moment.
Right. Okay, that's good. Well, we're resolving this in a very COVID-friendly way. Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Too late.
It's okay.
Okay. So this one here?
I think that would probably be one, yeah. That's great. Okay. So now we need to start the presentation.
Is this okay, Catherine? Can you see? Can you confirm?
Yes, we can see it. We can see it. Perfect.
Okay. So now is this started? Is the again? I can't quite tell. Can you see the actual presentation, or can you just...
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's fine. All right, so so the first thing I was going to do, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some work that I've done with a colleague of mine from the Global Forum for Media Development and the Ethical Journalism Network. I'll come to that in a minute. Let me first start by just introducing myself a little bit. I mean, obviously, Thomas has done a great job of actually explaining who I am. I'm presuming that you can all actually see the entire, like the whole presentation down the side, as well as the presentations on the screen. Or can you just see the actual main? You can see what I've got here. But okay, well, how do I start the actual presentation? Forgive me for being clueless. Yeah, that's okay. Forgive my my cluelessness. This is not my computer, so I'm certainly lost on this.
For that, do you use the because I don't know, I never use this.
Okay. Oh, hang on. Okay, yeah, there we go. Perfect. This should be the one. Start from the beginning. No,
But it doesn't do it.
okay. Right. Let's just go. Well, I'm going to continue anyway because I mean I'm sure that we can make our way through this with slightly smaller images. So okay, so the Migration Observatory was set up in 2011 with the specific intention of informing public debates on migration, and I was brought in to help to bridge the gap between media and academia, essentially. And so for the last 10 years or so, I've been doing that, working to share the research that we do and to try to demystify and to explain migration issues to journalists from a range of different publications, a range of different media types, and to try to make sure that we have a less polarized, more informed debate about the issue. One of the things that we do is to try to make sure that we don't go down a politicized route when we discuss these things. We don't try to make policy recommendations. We simply provide analysis and information about things. So the work that I've done in producing this recent handbook, which I've done with my, as I said, I've done with my colleague Tom Law from the Global Forum for Media Development, was actually done for a project which was set up by the International Centre on Migration Policy Development, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's an international sort of intra-government organisation which is based in Vienna. And it was specifically for a project working in former Soviet countries, so Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and various other post-Soviet states. And it was designed as part of a thing called the Memento program, which was designed to help support improved migration reporting in those states. However, in order to produce analysis or produce a piece of work which provides a set of guidelines for how journalists should report on the issue of migration, you can't really do something which is entirely regionally focused. It has to deal with the fundamental questions, fundamental issues involved in dealing with the issue of migration generally. So what we tried to do was to provide a detailed set of content on reporting migration, which was designed for journalists to use as a kind of handbook and reference book, but also for students that dealt with every aspect of migration that we thought that they were likely to come up against. So this is issues relating to terminology and how to use terminology properly, law, data, reporting ethics, practical tips on actually how to find people and which kind of people would be useful in order to understand certain aspects of the migration debate, decent contacts that people might be able to make and what have you. And the project was funded by the German Federal Foreign Office, which will bring me slightly later to some of the kind of questions about the public sphere and the role of government, for example, in actually guiding people towards certain ways of dealing with a complex and polarizing issue like migration. There is a link at the bottom of this slide, which I'm not even going to try to share at the moment because I have no idea how to use this computer, to the handbook, and I will try to make sure that it gets distributed later on by MFO. So that's the sort of general gist. Now, in order to try to communicate, the book in itself it started off designed to be, a quick guide to journalists and rapidly morphed into a really quite complex and large piece of work, it's designed to be very easy to dip in and out of. So each section is designed to be usable in a quick and easy way as a reference point for people. But in order to try and communicate the scale of the content in the handbook, I've provided a quick outline of just the index page. I mean, this is actually sort of shaped specifically so that we can see it on one PowerPoint slide. I obviously don't expect anybody to be able to read this, but just to set out the kinds of things that we've dealt with in there, you can see it starts with a bit about the ethical foundations of reporting. We then go through all of the different types of...
Rob, sorry, it doesn't work. We can't see your slides changing. We're just seeing the first one.
Okay, right. This is the problem that we're going through. Okay, let's just quickly, in that case, thank you for letting us know. There is an issue with how this is working on the thing. So let's just try again.
And share. Yeah.
I don't know.
Thomas, do you think you could maybe see if you can work out?
Can you help me, Thomas, a little bit? Because I have no idea.
I'll move out of the way.
Yeah. I mean, I have no idea how to work this.
Yeah. And now it should work.
It does. It does work. Yeah, well,
Yes.
yes.
Okay, so what? I have no idea what you guys can and can't see.
We can also see the slides down the side as well, Rob, though.
So let's see if we can just do the starting. Now, if you see,
Go to diaporama. Yeah, no.
No, so what do you
Yes.
have now?
This is the second slide, yeah, about me, the Migration Observatory. Is that, yes, good.
Hey, right, okay.
Sorry,
We're clear, so right. This is nobody's used to actually doing things in an actual place with actual people these days. We're trying to do something which is exotic in that it's actually dealing with human beings. So, okay, so let me move on. Okay, so I then, right, so the third slide was a quick outline of some of the stuff that I described a couple of minutes ago about the sorts of things that the book attempts to deal with a link at the bottom. Can you guys now see that? Yes, I hope so. Now
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Okay, good. Okay. So, right. So the stuff that's in the book, which I don't expect any of you to be able to read, this is where I just got to, is we start off with some work about the ethical foundations and how to do this kind of stuff. We then go through the multitude of different reporters and the different types of reporting that might mean that people encounter the issue of migration in one way or another, which ranges from political journalists and people dealing with economics and business, but also gets all the way down to things like people dealing with arts and culture. So people dealing with, reviewing TV shows or writing about art exhibitions or whatever it may be, who may be dealing with the issue of migration in various different ways. And very importantly, we look at the issue of production journalists, so the people who are actually producing the news papers or editing films or whatever it may be, and think about the kinds of interactions that they may have, because often these kind of non-specialist work reporters who are dealing with an issue, who aren't experts on migration, who haven't spent their time dealing with the issue in detail, are the people who are then sticking a headline on something or deciding how it should be illustrated with a picture or with music or whatever it may be, and that can have a very strong impact on the emotional response people have to a story. We then go through various things about trends in reporting migration. We have essentially a sort of a glossary of terminology and explanation of the kinds of words that get used or that are relevant for migration, what they mean, all of that kind of stuff. And then with an explanation to some extent of where there's problematic language and why that language may be problematic, why journalists might want to either avoid or qualify that kind of language as and when they come across it. And then we go into all of the multitude of different kinds of stories that are likely to come up, whether it be about family migration, study, about asylum and refugees, irregular migration, all of the multitude of different kinds of stories. And we have sections where we go through issues, ideas, tropes that kind of commonly come up and sort of things that people need to consider and get past. And then we work through issues relating to how to identify sources, the kind of people that you should know and deal with. There's a substantial section on interview techniques, so issues relating to, for example, dealing with migrants, with interviewing victims of trauma, the ethics of actually just how to do general reporting practices and all that kind of stuff. A section on experts, a section on data and analysis, a section on the kind of processes that sit underneath the governance of migration reporting or any kind of reporting, so things like press councils and how newsrooms work and all of that kind of stuff, and then a series of tools and resources. So the book itself has ended up being about 200 pages long, but it's designed to be something you can dip in and out of, depending on what you may want to be doing. It's designed to be a resource that can sit in a newsroom or sit in a journalism studies environment and allow people to kind of go in and just sort of choose the bits that they need to access in order to understand how to do things properly. Or you can start at the beginning and go the whole way through it. That's fine. So that's the general shape of what it is. So let me get now to a little bit about the kind of the rationale. Why do we need something like this? And I think the starting point for this is that media has reported on migration ever since there were media of communication. So if we look at what I mean, this is a slide that I use often to talk about these issues. Even going back into prehistory, we find the issue of mobility of people being communicated through the media of communication that exists at that time. We have a boat petroglyph here from Gobustan National Park in Azerbaijan, which dates back 10,000 years, which, okay, that may be a depiction of fishing, I mean, but it is a depiction of people moving. And we can even go, I mean, if that's not enough, then you can see that we have, you know, like consistently through history, through recorded history, had stories of migration. So the other image is an image of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we know that throughout, I mean, Abrahamic religions are, you know, predicated on all kinds of stories of migration, from the Exodus to the Hijra of Muhammad. You know, there are multiple stories about migration that sit underneath the kind of cultural foundations of all of our societies, and they tend to deal with the same kinds of issues all the way through human history and prehistory. These are issues of things like group identity and otherness, religious, cultural, and ethnic distinctions between one group and another, issues about land ownership and territorial rights, conflicts over resources, and even sort of more abstract concepts of the exotic versus the normal. And these are still the themes that we see being replicated time and time again through media depictions of migration. And as Thomas was saying at the beginning of this, one of the core parts of this, and I think something that is an inescapable factor of even constructing a national us, is that you have an extra-national them. And that sort of us and them sort of perspective tends to result in a more negative depiction of migrants than positive. Now, I mean, that's not necessarily in itself fundamentally problematic. It may be that the stories that people need to tell are about things that are broken, need to be fixed, and so many other types of stories will be fundamentally fairly negative. But it is problematic insofar as it introduces negativity into the concept of dealing with individuals on the basis of their migration status. And we see that this kind of negativity is something which is both obvious in mainly sending countries and mainly receiving countries. So I don't know how easy it is to actually see what we see on these charts on your screens, but this is some work that was done by Marie McAuliffe from IOM back in 2005, which was looking at the top chart deals with media depictions of migrants in countries like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Thailand, which are all obviously primarily sending countries. And still the issue of migration is dealt with in a broadly negative way. And that is often both the issue of emigration and the issue of immigration dealt with in a broadly negative way. And we see the same thing playing out in these mainly receiving countries, which we see below, which is Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. So we end up in this situation where, yeah, we're broadly speaking, these kind of the language that we see describing migrants, the way that people talk about these issues is broadly negative. Similarly, the work that we've done at the Migration Observatory on migration, on the descriptions of migrants, on the quantitative analysis of British press content about migration tends to focus on the negative. So we see, for example, this is actually from a slightly old piece of work that we did back in 2013, but by far and away the most common descriptor of immigrants broadly in British newspaper reporting over a 3-year period up to 2013 was the word illegal. So the difference in the scale of that term, that descriptor described as the way, in terms of the way that migrants were described, was massive. So the most common, it was a factor of about 10 times more likely to be used than any of the next most common terms, which were Eastern European in the tabloid and mid-market newspapers, and oddly Jewish in the broadsheet newspapers. Actually, just to be clear, that relates to the fact that Ed Miliband rather was the leader of the Labour Party at that point in time. So there were a lot of stories in the broadsheets about his origins as the child of Jewish refugees or Jewish immigrants. But so you can see the scale of focus on negative issues like irregularity and illegality in the description of immigrants. Similarly, we see within the descriptions of asylum seekers in the UK a focus on failure. So over the same period of time, the idea that asylum seekers were defined by the fact that they were likely to fail in their claims for asylum was the primary, but it was less of a comprehensive difference than illegal, but failed was by far the most common term for describing asylum seekers across tabloids, mid-market and broadsheet newspapers in the UK over that same period of time. And while debates change and the types of language being used and the areas of focus of media may move, that broad focus on sort of negative and problematic issues related to migration is core, as Thomas identified at the beginning. And this emerges from, I think, when we get into this issue of the public sphere. Now, I have to confess, I'm no scholar of Habermas whatsoever, so I don't want to get too sucked into something that I don't know enough about. But this idea of the exchange of ideas between equals that the public sphere is kind of predicated on is problematized substantially by this kind of large-scale commercial media, mainly because we end up with things like market segmentation, so the commercial construction of what we might consider to be communities of value. This is Bridget Anderson's description, these kind of like creating these groups of people who are driven by a campaigning objective to achieve various different things, whether it's the Guardian readers campaigning for better rights for asylum seekers, or whether it's Daily Mail or Daily Express readers campaigning for reduced levels of migration. There is a commercial imperative to ensure that you have people who are buying into an idea that that is being basically pushed within a media organization, so that they keep coming back to that media organization to reinforce the ideas that they have, or to support or as a kind of a rallying point for their ideas about the world. And there's this asymmetry of power as well. This issue that basically people's experience of the universe is shaped by organizations that have control over a primary flow of information. And if those organizations are, for example, supportive of a particular political party or an ideology, that means that they are able to construct realities, political realities, that people are brought along with. And something that I'm interested in is that it creates a tension between two factors that Edward Bernays, who's somebody I'm very interested in, was very interested in. the idea that freedom is predicated on the right to persuade. A free society is a society in which we have a right to persuade people of our perspectives on things. But also Bernays was the architect of the concept of public relations and believed that it was legitimate within a democratic society for people to employ what he described as engineers of consent, people who were designed to move people towards particular perspectives on things. And that tension between these two related ideas sits underneath the construction of migrants and of multiple other subjects within the media. And I think that fundamentally problematizes the public sphere in general. And it leads to a backlash. It leads to people feeling that they are being pushed into particular directions by media of one sort or another, or maybe even being told by media that the alternatives that they might see in different media are people trying to push them towards a particular perspective on things. But it's people trying to engineer their consent. It's not a free exchange of ideas between equals, but in fact it's vested interests and elites pushing you towards a particular perspective on issues. And that creates a rejection of media and a move towards alternative or niche media that feed a kind of motivated reasoning. If you're already anti-migrant and you're being told by people, well, there's a group of elites who want to push you towards thinking that migrants are wonderful and they're all pulling the wool over your eyes, then you're going to move more and more towards a position where you look for things that feed you the information that you want to see about those kinds of issues. So that fundamentally has implications for politics as a whole, and for public debate as a whole, because at the end of the day, there is this kind of there are these interplays between media, public attitudes, and policy making. They all affect one another in different directions, but the more that media pushes a certain agenda on these issues, and we've seen already that agenda tends to be broadly negative, the more that generates public support for the idea that there should be policies of reduction in flows, of punitive removals of people who may be in the country and deemed to be here without the right to be here. And so it creates a problematic, which then obviously, and I should say, once those policies start getting introduced, that leads to media reporting on those policies, which leads to more a reinforcing of those kind of public attitudes to these things, and creates a problematic scenario, a spiral, as it were. And it's also important to recognise that that flow of information. I mean, it's very easy to imagine that there is a simple process in the production of journalism, and that process, the creation of frames about migration, is essentially there is an event, it is reported on, and people then buy into that idea and are moved politically by it. But I mean, people like Robert Entman have identified these kind of processes that create framing biases within the media. That essentially, whatever facts you may encounter are filtered through a number of different sort of choices and points and things that occur before they turn into something that you then encounter as a consumer of news. It begins with, I mean, if you're dealing with a politicized subject of one sort or another, it begins with the skill of the people who sell you the information about that in the first place. So Entman has a rather complicated equation that he's produced, that I've produced a sort of graphic to explain, which basically, so you begin with the skill of the people on one side or the other of an argument and how effectively they sell that story to a journalist. It then goes through a process of the evaluation by those journalists of both the political game as a whole, what's going on generally around and about, how important is the issue of migration right now, how important is the issue of whatever else it might be. An idea of what the market wants to see, what are people going to buy, what do the audiences want to kind of like, what's going to make them excited about stuff. And then the personal ideology of that journalist as well, how do they feel generally about this stuff when they're reporting on it. And by the end of that process, you then got the various things that might happen outside of that, the various things that actually mean that there's a story being produced about it, and then the news actually emerging from it. And my question, and the reason for this book to some extent, is that without some framework to provide people with guidance for how you could do things differently, or why there may be an issue with the way that people might be doing this kind of thing, I think that people are entirely in the hands of those people at the beginning of that sort of pyramid, as it were, those engineers of consent who might be driving you in one direction or another. So to create a framework, and I think a role that academia can play in supporting this kind of thing, is to create, as neutrally as possible, baseline ways that this kind of thing can be done. Not necessarily saying it should be done that way, but providing a kind of a bottom line sort of explanation for why certain things are done in the way that they are, and what you might do to challenge that, or how you might perceive things differently. So that's one of the reasons that we've done. And I think that, you know, just to explain this, I mean, like the processes that journalists go through in order to actually create stories about migrants aren't necessarily considered in a really deep and complex way while they're doing it. They are instinctive. So, I mean, from a piece of work that I did for the Reminder project, which was analysing how, you know, the social and political factors that shape the way that journalists report on things, on migration specifically. I mean, I pulled out this quote from one of the journalists that I spoke to, who said, I think it's guided by media convention. It's not a conspiracy, it's not a discussed process, but people just fall into sort of homogenized language around migrancy, but also around any other number of issues, because I think it means there's sort of uniformity around sort of meaning, intention, and so on. So I think media outlets kind of mirror each other in terms of language, and you can see changes in language and terminology coming in. So his point is that they all just feed off each other. I mean, at the end of the day, this is the nature of journalism. A narrative becomes established, ways of talking about things, and language become established. And the point of doing something like producing this handbook on migration reporting is to create an opportunity for people to actually explore whether or not what they've done is fallen into a convention, rather than allow themselves to analyze things and do things properly. So just to kind of wrap up, I would say that, I mean, media does shape the way that people access the world. You know, I mean, it affects our access to ideas, and powerful and large companies can play an unequal role in shaping the way that we think about things. But actually, I mean, one of the things that I should probably put down here is that journalists tend to come at issues with a really quite idealistic perspective on what their role is. You know, they believe strongly that what they're doing is an important part of the democratic process, and they are quite open to being guided towards doing things in a way which is better. They may be ideological in the way that they want to do things. They may want to do things in a particular way, and they may be guided by the media organisations that they are working to do things in a particular way. If they're in a position where they can actually say, well, actually, doing it that way is problematic, and here are 5 reasons why, and here's a guidebook which explains to you why, that can help to challenge some of those things. Because migration is massively complicated. And the best way that we can improve that process, the reporting of that highly complicated issue, is to support engagement and understanding of those issues among the people who are providing us with that kind of that look at the world that media provides. And this, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there is this national us and an external them. That is the way that media has constructed the way that these things operate. And that creates a situation where, unless we challenge these dominant narratives, migration will always be perceived as a fundamental threat. But, and this is my last point, is that obviously the work that we've done, I mean, this is work that I think is extremely neutral and well done, and it's thoughtful and not ideological, but it has been paid for by somebody. And actually, in this case, it's been paid for by the German Federal Foreign Office. And there is a question about whether or not a government funding academics to tell journalists how to do things is actually in keeping with this, you know, with this equal exchange of ideas among, you know, or the exchange of ideas among equals that underpins this concept of the public sphere and how it, you know, this idealistic world of how it should be. But if we don't have governments or academics providing this kind of thing, who's going to do it? So it's a problematic scenario. It's complicated. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I'm concerned that I've been a bit incoherent and rambling in this, and I apologize if I've taken too long. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's yeah, very extremely interesting presentation. We see that writing this handbook, you had to really to get into the mechanics of the production of the media narrative about migration. Up until the very going to the theoretical level as well. It was and thinking reflexively about the role of academics in this process, of course. And all right, so now we're moving on to Catherine. Catherine Guilyardi, can you share your screen? Rob?
Oh, yes, I can try. How do we do that? Yeah, I think you should do it. It's all in French, and my French is possible, but it's not good enough to.
Right.
Right. Shall I keep? Maybe I'll keep that headphone because it was easy to listen to you. Is the sound good with the headphone, or should I take them off?
Yeah, indeed. Right, so let me introduce you, Catherine, first. All right, Catherine Guilyardi is a radio journalist and documentary producer for the French and British public broadcasters. You more particularly work for BBC and Radio France since 1993. And you've been specializing on the issues relating to migration since the 90s. You work closely with the Musée National de l'Histoire de l'Immigration in Paris. You also work for the science review on immigration. You also had to create a media office or a media relation office for the Institut Convergence Migration in 2018. It's an institute which gathers 400 researchers in France. And you also were part of a pool of journalists from Africa, America, Asia, and Europe. You were invited by the IOM in Tunis in December 2019 to draft this ethical charter for media coverage of migration. And you are going to talk about this just now. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm going to, can you hear me well?
Yeah, very well.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, so I'll present myself quickly. I've been a journalist for 30 years, as you've mentioned. Started my career at the BBC French service in London, but I've been working for the BBC radios as a freelance in France for, I don't remember, but a long time. When I left London, I'm a reporter in France as well for RFI, Radio France Internationale, and a documentary producer for Radio France and for the BBC. I've worked on many topics as many journalists, but I specialized on migrations, and I've done many reports in my career, mainly for radio on migration issues. But as I understand, the conversation here is about journalists and researchers. I will focus on this. I've worked with researchers several times in my career. The first time I've worked, and I'm going to share my screen. No, where is it? Yep. The first time I worked with researchers in France was in 2006 and 2007 for the opening of the French National Museum on the history of immigration. It is set in Paris. It's been since that moment when it was open in 2007. The second time I worked with researchers was I wrote a book with IPCC climate scientist Eric Guilyardi. As you can see, he's my brother as well. We have the same name, on the communication of climate science in medias and how those researchers dealt with deniers, and also started to get trained or to train to speak in the media. That I thought was very interesting when you work on migration, as I did, to see how climate scientists had to find the good way to communicate with the media in order to communicate with the public. We can talk about this. The third time I work with researchers, you see, I do like them, is between 2018 and 2020. It ended this summer for the Institut Convergence Migration. The Institut Convergence Migration was created in France at that time, 2018, and it has 400 fellows who work on migrations, and Thomas is one of them, actually, Thomas Lacroix. And the idea of bringing a journalist in this was that to help create tools for these fellows to communicate to a large public on this issue. And so we have created De Facto, that you can see here. It's a monthly, actually it's become every 2 months now, and I don't work there anymore, but I'll show you. So it's there are articles, there are videos, and it was once a month. The last work I did with them was last summer. I worked actually on the Trajectoire and Origine, trajectory and origin investigation here by the INSEE, the National Institute for the Statistics in France, with Patrick Simon, that some of you might know. So I also participated while I was with the Institut Convergence Migration on the debates on creating or not an international panel on migration and asylum. It was called the GIEM or the IPM, and let me show you. The International Panel on Migration and Asylum. The idea was to create, like the IPCC, something for researchers on migration to relate and to have to work like the IPCC. But one of the aim was to challenge the preconceived ways, and I'm quoting them, of thinking about migration and asylum with scientifically rigorous, independent, and dispassionate approach. So the communication aspect of migration and of the research on migration is very important for the IPM. It's an ongoing process, but obviously it doesn't have the same financing as the IPCC, as you can imagine. So it is difficult for them to make it as big as the IPCC, obviously. But the idea is of researchers taking their own stance on communicating and how they can indeed, and this was my idea as well, they can indeed intervene in this communication on migration. So the question of the coverage of migration issues also, as Rob was explaining, has prompted journalists to question their own practice. And I was invited in 2019 to contribute to the elaboration of the so-called Ethical Charter for Media Coverage on Migration. It was drafted by journalists, mostly from Africa and Europe, and some NGO and journalists organizations. We were invited indeed by the IOM, that you know, the International Organization for Migration. And the idea is that the IOM, whose missions you might know, also works or wants to work on newsmaking, and saying they say that it should be based, this newsmaking, on the international law or laws and the facts. And they explained to us, journalists coming to Tunis that December 2019, that social exclusion of migrants can be costly to countries. And don't forget that the IOM actually acts for UNO members for what they call a humane and orderly migration. And this opens actually, Rob, you ended your presentation saying that who's going to pay to train journalists and who's going to pay to give guidance to journalists who cover migration. And I'm very surprised to see how many international organizations are involved in that today. The IOM is one of them. So let me show you. So what we ended up drafting was the ethical charter. You have it in French here, for media coverage of migration. There are 6 principles. We can talk about them later if you like, but basically talking about terminology, as Rob was explaining in the book that he did with Tom Lowe and the ICMPD, the fact that a journalist should put a distance between him and the hate speech and racism, the fact that migrants are individuals and that journalists should invite them to become actors in the debate on migrations, and that there should be a consent from the migrant, and we call it an informed consent of the migrant, that his or her story is going to be published, as well as his or her image. And as it was mainly aimed at African countries, from what I understood of the organization of this gathering, African journalists, North African as well as what we call sub-Saharan or Black African journalists, it was highlighted by some of my colleagues from Niger, for example, who said, look, we have to pay for the migrants to tell us their stories, or we have to pay to take a photo and all that. So one of the things that the charter was really saying was, no, you cannot pay as a journalist to get a photo. So I think it's important to see who it's aimed at, this charter, as Rob was talking about, aiming at the former USSR satellites with a book that they wrote. But there are many charters as this one, and it's one of the first actually of the kind I wanted to show you is first I want to show you that the International Federation of Journalists inspired this charter a lot, that was drafted with the help of the IOM. But one of the first kind, the first of the kind, this kind of charter of code of ethics, sorry my accent, was actually drafted in 2008 in the Charter of Rome. Is as much as I know those charters, is one of the code of conduct that has been quoted by journalists as being the most serious and thorough one. So it's called the Code of Conduct on Migrants, Asylum Seekers, Refugees, and Victims of Trafficking. And it was adopted by Italian journalists and organizations and the UNHCR. So again, an international organization. The European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance also contributed regularly in updating this charter. And it's really interesting to see that they have published guidelines, like Rob, you published this book, and I know the work has been done by Tom Lowe as well. So the guidelines for the application of the Rome Charter. And I think it's really interesting to see, because one of the main questions for me is, who are these charters aiming at? Who are we talking to? I mean, it's not, I'm a journalist working on migrations. I work for international medias. I don't need, if I could say, this kind of charters. But it's interesting to see that these guidelines, who have been published in several languages, I think 5 of them, and they using actually many sources. It's a really, really good work that's been done here, I think. Focuses on local, oops, sorry, why am I here? On local media. Let me show you. I had prepared everything, but obviously, no. Oh yes, sorry, coming down. So it's giving guidelines, you see, for different kind of reporting. But I think what's really interesting is the focus that they put on local media, on local sources, and the way local media actually use public service information as well. And because local media do shape public opinion on migrants very much. And what's very interesting as well is that they doesn't work. They this year, when these guidelines were actually published, they actually decided to focus on some minorities that they've noticed that that were particularly not well, some minority groups that really needed, here it's the Rom and Sinti, needed a focus on for journalists. And these guidelines end with one of the main aspects of those charters, which is the terminology. Will it work this time? No, I had prepared everything not to have to turn the pages, but it doesn't work. That's okay. The terminology here, and there's a glossary at the end as well. I mean, of course, the words that we use are very important. And I think here the part that researchers play in the words, in the terms that we use is very, very interesting. And the last thing I want to show you is this diversity checklist to be used by journalists in general before publishing a story, but particularly here on migration. And I think it's really interesting because it shows that it's a very complex, as Rob has shown in his presentation, it's a very complex process to understand how it works from the moment a journalist reports and the moment that it's published and how it's being perceived. And I think one of the main questions for us journalists is who do we work for and who do we write for, and in which context, but especially who is it, who are those charters aimed at, and who are the medias aimed at? I think, do the facts really change perceptions? In general, that's a very, very interesting and important question, I think, that's been asked in many topics, not only on migration. And can the journalists help change the narrative with the help of those who research on migration for years? Or do we have to change the journalists? Rob was talking about changing the education of journalists, and I think this is one of the main questions. I've worked on this a lot, and I do train journalists myself, so we can talk about this. But changing the narrative is also something very complex. And the last thing I would say is never forget that the media are a reflection of our societies. And it's difficult to say it in English, but we do have the leaders that we deserve, but we also do have the medias that we deserve. And I think Montesquieu said that, if I'm right. That's the last thing I would say for this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Right. Yeah, indeed, it's a tricky issue. It's to change the public opinion of the journalist at first. It's a cat and mouse game. Sorry, excuse me. Right. How shall we proceed, Mogens? Do you want me to?
Yes, I think you can just.
There's a question here. There's a question.
There's a question. Yes. So, when it comes to question, we can ask the people to either put their question in the chat box, right? So also you can raise your hand and speak directly. We can also read your question in the chat. Where do you want to read the questions?
Yes. So I don't have the computer.
Or maybe this
So there's a question here that is so this is a question from Rosaline, who's asking. I don't have her full name. I'm sorry about that.
Rosaline Cunningham.
Thank you very much. You've spoken on.
Sorry, it's a very long name.
Yes, it doesn't show. So would you like to ask the question yourself?
Well, sure. It wasn't. It was actually to both of you, because I know that you've both focused mainly on the role of journalists, and just going back to some of the text that was in the introduction to the event, I was kind of thinking a bit more about the role of the academic, because I know, Rob, as an ex-journalist, and Catherine, as a journalist, that you do have a particular style and a discourse, and obviously the writing conventions that academics use are very different. And I wonder, like, if this ever becomes an issue, particularly when you both obviously work with academics and researchers a lot. Do you think that this kind of very authoritative and scholarly voice, which I know is needed for academic journals, but it kind of gives an impression of objectivity and positionality, for want of a better word, but I always wonder that, well, academics are actually also citizens. I mean, Rob is always teasing me about being an activist, but and I don't think, obviously, academics, shouldn't necessarily and can't always be activists, but they are citizens too. They are readers of newspapers and consumers of media, and I wonder, like, where that line is, that sometimes we expect academics, particularly in media interviews, we expect them to take a stance, and that doesn't happen very often. And I just wondered, is that ever a challenge, or how should we challenge that?
Catherine, do you want to start?
No, go ahead, Rob. I think as well our countries will have different answers to that. I mean, researchers do not have the same status. I mean, well, I'm sure Thomas could answer that actually in each country.
So, I mean, I think that there's, the first thing I would do is to direct you towards another book that I contributed at least a part of the chapter to, which is Bridging the Gaps, which was done by, it's edited by Martin Roos and Joachim Palm, which actually deals with precisely this issue, the question of, like, what's the relationship between academia, media, policy making, and specifically on the issue of migration. It's a complex and difficult subject, and, like, what should the role of academia be in this situation is really challenging. I mean, the existence of the Migration Observatory, is sort of an effort in some respects to kind of for academia to participate in policy debates without creating the kind of, like, this idea of the activist academic, which is really, it can be quite destructive to both academia and also to policy making, insofar as it undermines the validity. It can be seen to undermine the validity of research because it's driven by a policy agenda of the individual, rather than just a pure focus on analysis and proof. But I also think that it's completely legitimate. At the end of the day, people do this work. People often become academics specifically because they care deeply about something, and they become deeply involved in it and become specialists in the area. And there's an expectation often on the part of journalists that actually the role of the academic is to be entirely dispassionate and to just provide, simple facts without a kind of an emotional response to them at all. And I think that can be unrealistic. But again, I mean, we get to a question of, like, okay, that's all of that said, what's the, how should journalists actually undertake to deal with that sort of information? Should they present academic analysis and say, well, this is proof that that A or B is 100% true? No, they shouldn't. They need to be recognizing that every issue is complex, and the nuance is really what matters. And an academic can give you a way of understanding something deeply and in a positive or just positive is the wrong way of putting it, in a thorough and sort of useful way, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the only way of understanding something. And so, I mean, I think we all have a part to play in trying to construct a positive reality around ourselves, whatever we consider that to be. That process of, like, the persuading people, our freedom to persuade people of the reality that we think is important and valid and all that kind of stuff. But academic, so I mean, in answer to your question, Rosalie, I think that it's based on the conscience of the individual, always, both for the journalist and for the academic. If you believe that what you stand for, what you research, whatever it may be, needs to get out there, needs to be seen, and needs to be understood, then you shouldn't be held back from communicating it with people just because you work in academia. In the same way that a journalist, if they believe something fundamentally and deeply, should be allowed to explore that and write about it and deal with it or report on it. So I don't know. I don't think there's a a clear answer to this kind of thing. I think that effective communication is important on the part of academics, which I think is also a part of the point that you're making, and like clarity and simplicity can be really important, but it's also important sometimes not to undermine the complexity of a subject by simplifying it too much in order simply to sell a simple message to journalists. That was a really rambling answer, sorry.
I can react on this because as a matter of fact, I know I've worked on the Science Media Center in London, and I now hear about your observatory. We don't have such intermediates here in France. This intermediate between journalists and the academic world are very important. Also, when I worked on this book with my brother on climate science, he works for the University of Reading, so we came to London. We've seen that in the British government, you have scientists, you have people coming from the university working with the government. In France, it is very difficult for researchers to have access to policymakers. They are invited to talk, but what they tell us, journalists, and when I work with the researchers with the Institut Convergence Migration those last year, they say, look, we are invited, you know, the president invites me, the minister for the interior invites me or whatever, but they don't listen to me. So we go to the media. So this is where the collaboration started. Same with the climate scientists. I think the university in France, where we call l'université, or the word of research, was used by journalists, as they are by British media, to bring the, as Rob was saying, you know, because it's a researcher saying it, then it is true, you know, 100%, which is crazy when you think that science never worked with 100%, and science is doubt, science is complexity. But anyway, there was a divide, you know, there was the researcher and the journalist. And since I think it really started with those public debates, it's not a scientific debate that, you use the word polarized. And I think this is the main problem on the coverage on migration. It's also been a problem with the coverage of climate change, where suddenly the media has decided that they could bring in the scientific debate into the media. And it's a big mistake. Do you know that the BBC actually today, also since a long time, refuses what they call false debates on some scientific complex issues? But let's come back to the migrants. It's not a problem. Migration is not a problem like climate change is. So it's complex, because it's not saying, oh, it's a problem, let's do something. It's a complex story, very much polarized by the political world and those who have the power. The problem is that the media are seen as people who have the power today as well. And this is part why they are not read, they are not listened to, and that the researchers as an institution are also seen as bringing this sort of upward or higher point of view, saying this is like this, you know, believe us. And some people reject that, as Rob was saying. So I think today journalists and researchers find themselves in the same world and find that it's a moment to try to collaborate and work together on very complex and very complex issues that are polarized for political reasons, and to see how we can work together. I've been working on this for many years now. I don't have the solution, because I think we are in a very different world as journalists and as researchers, and it's very difficult, at least in France, to bridge the gap. So I'm glad you bridged the gap, Rob, in Britain, but I have to admit that it is still very, very difficult to work together. I've done it for the museum, I've done it for the Institut Convergence Migration for 2 years. There is a moment where we cannot communicate together because the journalists create a product. We create a report. It's very short, sometimes it's long. Of course, it's a caricature, or it's seen as simplistic when it just wants to be simple. by the researcher. It's very difficult to find where we can talk together. In France at least. And I think the only way would be to have those intermediary bodies like the observatory you have in Britain, or like the Science Media Centre in London. But who can finance this, and why should we finance this? It's the whole story. I'll just finish on the education of journalists. Where do researchers intervene in the education of journalists? Well, not much, I have to say, because we have two bodies of education in France. We have the university and we have the grandes écoles, like you have Oxford would be a grande école in France, or the higher sort. And the journalists are actually trained by grandes écoles, not universities. So sometimes we have a researcher coming for a week, teaching for a week on migration, for example, and then the next week it's going to be on climate change, and the next week it's going to be on some other topic that it's in the news often, and that's it. Journalists are not trained as academics. They sometimes go for 3 years at university, but they are not specialists as some as of course as researchers are. So again, I'm not very optimistic, I have to say, after all those years, to see how we can bridge the gap and work together. But there is a clear will to work together, because the moment is there's a problem. There's definitely a problem, and maybe we can work together to change things. I don't know how.
May I just quickly respond to something that Catherine's come back to a couple of times, which I think is really fundamental. It's something that I've found in the research that I've done as well, is that one of the challenges that we have is that we talk about bridging a gap between media and academia. We talk about trying to even kind of use media to achieve sort of a better outcome for migration, whatever it may be. But we forget the fact that media isn't one thing. And Catherine alluded to this earlier on. The media in France is fundamentally different to the media in the UK, which is fundamentally different to the media in Germany, which is fundamentally different to the media in Italy, America, or anywhere else. These are environments which, I mean, okay, there are maybe products which are produced that are similar, but at the end of the day, all of these national media conventions that emerge are specific to those locations. And trying to change everything together, trying to change the way that media deals with migration, ignores the fact that you're actually dealing with a multitude of different things that need to change, a multitude of different environments that need to change. The motivation for somebody to become a British tabloid newspaper reporter is fundamentally different to the motivation that the motivation that, for example, a German person who wants to go into being a journalist might have to go into working in newspapers there. They are different universes. They're built on a different conception of what journalism is, a different idea about the responsibilities of journalists, all of that kind of thing. And so I think it's really, really important for us to recognize that all of these situations are built around the national environment, around our own experiences. It's not one process that we can fix together.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to add something from the point of view of the researcher themselves, because obviously there is no one researcher, and the way we engage with public sphere and with the journalists in general and the outside world varies from different from one researcher to the other. And I would say, my research on the engagement with the critique in general, we have highlighted 3 ideal types. I mean, you got researchers who talk to other researchers. They are the academics, and they don't bother disseminating their research outside of to the outside world. It's not an issue. You got the researcher who engage with the policymakers, with the administration, with the they are the experts. So the way they express themselves, the places they position themselves are different. And the third type is the militants. So the researcher talking to associations, to civil society organizations who defend its own viewpoint. And so, of course, depending on the type of the researcher, the journalist will deal with, he will have another different responses, different interactions. And obviously the journalists, well, they are looking for they are looking for experts or sometimes militants, but yeah, for them, having a pure academic exposing the research in a very complicated way, very nuanced, it's not something he's looking for. So there is also a training to be provided to researchers to learn how to deal with journalists. I know, for example, there are training courses provided by the CNRS to researchers to learn how to communicate with the journalists, but nobody takes it. And I did ask for it. Did you know that there was such a training? No, nobody knows about that. And I tried to get this training for the last 4 years. I've never managed to get access to it. So it's still something which is burgeoning and which is emerging. And yeah, there are basic things to be done here. And I mean, it's yeah, there are huge room for maneuver, I suppose. Yeah.
Can I intervene on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I think the British and the French reality is very different. I mean, having worked with the British public, when you interview people, the way they respond, the way the orality, I mean, the speech, it's not only the British, but the Americans are good at that as well. Explaining with, you know, on TV or radio is easier. For some reason, in your education, you learn how to do that. For French academics, writing is okay, but see, Thomas is laughing because he knows. It hasn't been valued by the French educational system to speak out, basically, to speak. Write, yes. Speaking, no. So basically, researchers in France do have this problem to come in the media and try to be simple, short, and, you know, spot to the point, giving a metaphor, making us laugh if they can. No, well, I know British people can do that much easier. So, but it's also because it hasn't been valued by the education. Not only in universities, but before that, even in high school. It is changing now, but definitely there is there's a difficulty for researchers, and it's not valued. Sometimes it is really despised by one's colleague. I know some researchers who have been despised by their colleagues because they go in the media often to talk about what they work on, and because they have maybe this agenda, they want to change things. If not activists, at least they are convinced that they can change things. So they understand that doing it is speaking louder than using their specialized reviews, which is going into the mainstream media. But it's difficult for them. It is changing now. It is also changing because the government who finances research asks its researchers and says, look, we are paying for you. This is public money, so you owe the public a part of, you know, what you do, of your time. So it pushes researchers in France to communicate. So I think we are at this moment, at least, where researchers and journalists or media and academia have to meet because of needs from both sides. It's really interesting because the BBC used to pay academics when they were interviewed. The French media never did. You could have a news bulletin with 5 researchers being interviewed on different topics, and they would feed the media basically with their expertise and not being paid. And I was so surprised when I worked for the BBC that they would pay the researchers and the experts basically. And I thought, yeah, of course they do contribute to the media. So anyway, there's something new to invent. I think a need for the academics to know the media. I mean, Rob, you're right to say there's not just one media. It's very complex. And the economy of this sector is not doing well. We are not doing well. There's all these new medias coming out as well. I mean, when you see that Emmanuel Macron is come out with YouTubers, with millions of people watching him, you know, something is changing there. So definitely that's one thing. And the media have to learn how the academic world works as well. I think people in the media do not have the idea of how much precarity there are among researchers, and how many young researchers who do not make out a living out of their work, that they've worked years and years to get a 6 months job or etc. So I don't have to tell you that, I think you know that. And I think one of the main things is maybe we can work together to change the narrative. If we consider all this that we've been saying, change the narrative together, but it's a very, very difficult thing. But I have to say, I think the narrative is changing. You talked about vocabulary, talked about the terms that are used. I see changes. I'm not an academic, so I do not have a scientific a proof of that, but I can see words changing, people using words that are different and talking about words, immigrant, migrant, you know, but not really knowing which word to use, réfugié, but it's there. But I mean, I would ask a question to everyone here, but don't you think the problem is that people don't like complexity in general? It's a complex issue. It's not black and white. Isn't it the problem that most of us are lazy and we don't want to make it, you know, we don't want complex. We don't want complexity. So how do you want to make a coverage of such a complex question that is not good or right, bad or wrong?
If I may try your response, it's not only complexity that's a problem. Migration, like climate change, so people, what people think about these two issues is not only based on their understanding of facts. It's also based on, it's also a way of belonging. It's people are pro or anti-migration because it's the way they are in their social environment. It's a cultural positioning, like being in favor or acknowledge or denying climate change is also a cultural or class position. So that's now it's really extremely rooted in the presentation of the world of the people and the way they are in their own social environment. That's why I think it's so difficult to tackle.
I also think that, I mean, it's we're talking about the multiple different sort of media contexts and media environments that exist. Migration, you can't, the word migration is almost meaningless. Or migrant is almost meaningless because it could describe a vast array of different things. And when you think about public attitudes to migration, you have to think about basically what are people imagining. And so my former colleague at the observatory, Scott Blinder, did a load of research which was looking at this concept of the imagined migrant. So when you look at like public attitudes to the issue of migration, you have to interrogate when somebody says, well, I'm anti-migration, or I want to see reductions in migration, or I want the migrant population to be less. You have to then ask them another question. Well, who are you thinking about? You know, who is the migrant that you don't want? And so Scott did some analysis on this, and we did work on this back in 10 years ago now. But looking at basically like if you do a public opinion survey and you say, right, okay, there's 75% of the people, which is what it was at that point in time, are saying we want to see reduced immigration. We then said to them, okay, well, what do you want specifically? Which groups do you want to see reduced in numbers? And actually, what people identified was illegal immigration, irregular migrants, and it's like, well, okay, we can reduce. Even if there was zero irregular migrants, okay, the numbers that you're going to see are still going to be super high. Are you happy with that? Well, then it's kind of low-skilled workers. At that point in time, it was all about the EU, which was a fundamental factor in a number of different things. But people were broadly not that concerned about the issues that actually were dominating migration to the UK at that point in time, which was actually study. Study was the largest number. Skilled migration, skilled migrants, they were super happy with. So actually, people construct an idea of what they've got a problem with, which is not necessarily based on reality. Because migration, I mean, like migration in itself is such a vast, and I mean, like you're talking about people not liking complexity, Catherine. I think each individual component of it is not complicated. We're perfectly happy to have a wealthy banker coming in. We're perfectly happy to have an asylum seeker who's escaping some awful situation come in. We've just constructed an idea of what the overall kind of homogeneous mass that we call migration is, and we've decided we don't like that. And that's a problem, because it's turning something which is a multitude of different stories into one story, and that's where the problem arises, I think.
I think there's something right about that. I had one remark about the complexity issue. I mean, so that people don't like it, that might be, or that they're lazy, maybe too, but it's also just the fact that there are things that are so complex they can't understand it. And they're not supposed to, because they're not researched. I mean, this is of course something that is exacerbated when you're dealing with the relations between the hard sciences and the public spheres of. I mean, of course, the question of climate change has been very important in that respect, and you can see how that has been communicated by the scientific community since Laerke studies back in 2004. They're just throwing surveys of that the scientific consensus at you again and again and again and again, and now there's 15,000 scientists that all agree about something, but nobody explains how they came to these conclusions, because the science behind it is so complex that people won't grasp it. So the scientists stand with this problem with how do you communicate a result where what is behind this is black box. You can't communicate this to the public because they won't understand it. And I think the same problem actually also shows up with these very politically frayed issues as migration and all the stuff that Thomas is working on here, and how all the different kinds of factors that affect people, how they move around in the world. That these issues are too complex for them to be communicated to a public who's not specialist. So I think there's it's not just a question of, of let's say, not feeling happy about it or not wanting to deal with complexity, but the general public does not have the tools to do it. I mean, I don't have the tools to deal with the complexity of climate science. So there's also an epistemic issue, a real epistemic issue. So just another small thing on that. I think many ways. So the communication problem here becomes exacerbated by the fact that to say the interface, which is the journalists who are supposed to communicate these things, have not been educated. So I wanted to come a little bit back to these charters that are giving out about how do you communicate these things, and I wanted to hear something a little bit about, have you any way of measuring or having any idea about all these very nice charters, the Rome charter that you set up, whether it actually works, whether the journalists actually abide by it, whether they respect it, whether they, do they work, these charters? I mean, they're very good, but.
You're asking me? No, I have
I'm asking both of you. I mean,
but I think it's a very good question. As I was saying, who is it aiming at? Who are they aiming at? Those books, those charters, those guidelines? Again, I mean, when we were in Tunis with all those, I was with all those journalists working on migration. We were clearly not the public it was aiming at, because we know all this already, and we are careful about this already because we work on the topic. So it's aiming at the general, general media. This is, I mean, migration as climate change is one of the main topics today in the media. So it is interesting that these charters should exist. I have no idea how much, maybe in Italy they have studied it, because again, the Charter of Rome has been here for a while now, and Italy obviously has been one of the countries that has welcomed, if the word is right, many migrants in those last years. So maybe there's academic work on this. I don't know. As far as I don't.
I'm not aware of any work which has been able to actually kind of quantify the impact of these kind of charters. But one of the things that is, right, so let me firstly start by saying in the book that we've done, one of the first things that appears in there is Catherine's the charter from Tunis, because it's fantastic as a sort of set of ethical guidelines. But there's one of the things that we're talking about here is complexity. Now, when you talk about something in the whole, it's massively complex. When you break it down to its component parts, it's often considerably less complex. So the difference, to some extent, between what we've done with the handbook that we've produced versus something like the guidelines that Catherine's produced, which are obviously fantastic as a sort of ethical framework, is that we've gone into specific detail about specific issues. So if you're looking at, for example, do migrants take jobs from natives, which is a classic trope in media stories about migration. We've got analysis of things like the lump of labour fallacy. So the fact that, right, okay, just and this is something you can communicate quite simply to a journalist, and it often makes them go, ah, you know, which is to say, like, right, okay, there isn't a fixed number of jobs in an economy. I mean, I know this is just kind of trotting stuff out there. I'm sure everybody knows already, but there aren't a fixed number of jobs in an economy. So when people come in, they create demand for goods and services. When they create demand for goods and services, that creates more opportunities, it creates more jobs. QED, you've got a situation where it's not straightforward. There's analysis that you can look at, which also indicates that there are situations in which you have competition, but there's a difference between competition and complementarity, depending on the migrant skill sets, depending on who they are. So things like that, you can break down and you can deal with, but you require a lot. So the point is not so much that migration is complex, it's that it's multifaceted. There are a huge number of different components to it. And when you talk about it as one kind of big homogeneous thing, it's impossible. But when you talk about each of the individual parts, it's more straightforward to deal with it. So I think you can do stuff like that. But then going back to this other point as well about like dealing with complex issues as a whole. Now, this brings us back to this kind of concept that, so Edward Bernays talked about the idea that in a democracy, the world is so damn complicated that you have to have people who guide people towards rational conclusions about that. These are the people that he described in the 40s as, you know, these engineers of consent. With it, and he's described this as a kind of fundamental requirement of a free society, that life is just too difficult for everybody to know everything about climate change, migration, economics, and all these kinds of things, and make their informed decisions. So he thinks you should have these people who guide people towards particular perspectives on things, right? Which in the kind of abstract sounds fine, but the reality of that is that we end up being in the situation where, because these issues are complex, they're hijacked by individuals with agendas who push them forward in a way which then creates narratives that are fundamentally problematic. And when we have media which are often highly politicized, often driven by not just commercial, but just individual ideological agendas, when you have media organizations that are owned by people who have very specific positions on things, and then journalists who begin to work towards an imagined version of what that proprietor or their editor might want. So even if their editor doesn't even go in and say, I want you to do a story like this, which most often they will not do, those journalists working for politicized media organizations will still end up writing stuff that they know is not going to get spiked because of the fact that, and they will do that rather in a way which ends up veering towards an ever more cartoonish version of their imagined version of what Rupert Murdoch or Paul Dacre or whoever it may be wants to see. And we found this so I did research into the practices of media, of journalists reporting on migration in the UK, and we did comparative analysis with journalists in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary. And it was clear that an awful lot of journalists who were working in these environments were specifically doing that thing where they weren't being told how to report on these things, but they were finding themselves slipping into doing things in a way that they knew was what the editor wanted, a kind of implicit version of a politicized reality that was hard to get away from. That is a problem, and the only way that you can push people into a different way of doing things is to provide them with the ability to say, this is the wrong way, it's unprofessional for me to do things like this, I shouldn't use this kind of terminology because it's significantly problematic and incorrect, it's actively wrong and I'm failing in my duty, even to do proper quality journalism, even by the measures that I have of working for the tabloid newspaper that I work for, that's the wrong thing to do. And I actually have something in front of me which allows me to say why this is wrong. So that's the thing that I think you need in these circumstances. You need to, the complexity can be challenged by having something which is comprehensive in identifying the different sections and the different ways and the different places in which there are problems. And so I think that it's really important to have ethical frameworks and a general direction of travel that people should kind of be working towards in order to do work properly. But you also have to break it down to the specific components. Sorry, that was a bit ranting.
I can see that there's a question. chat. So I'll just read that one. I have it from Jacob Skipper, who asked, regarding the Momenta project, even when originating from a position of humanitarian concern, isn't it rather impolitic for a nation to fund work that aims to intervene
the popular discourse of another country?
yes.
And like, yeah, do you want me to read it? You can't see it?
Yes, because I can't see it.
And like NGO work, where policy advocacy is often, how do you say that? Overt? I don't know how to pronounce this, overt and expected, there may be a risk that this will be perceived as more insidious interference. After all, journalists don't advertise their education and political affiliation in the masthead, especially in countries led by parties campaigning on tensions against Germany and the EU. Has this been a problem, and how would you manage or avoid that perception pushback?
Okay, so I mean, from my point of view, I mean, I'm slightly removed from this in that I don't work for ICMPD, I don't work for the government of Germany. I was paid to do a piece of consultancy work with Tom Law, which was to produce this handbook. So that kind of, certainly the criticism we have not encountered that criticism yet from anyone. We are conscious of it. Well, I mean, like both Tom and I were actually somewhat uncomfortable about the way that I mean, if you've seen the handbook, you'll see it's got a big German eagle on the front cover of it. It's quite obvious that it's been funded by the German government, which we were both a little kind of like, well, you know, isn't that going to be firstly off-putting for journalists? Aren't they going to feel like they're being sort of like handed sort of, you know, propaganda? But obviously, what we have done with that piece of work is to do something which is extraordinarily careful and cautious. Based, I mean, it's very, very carefully reviewed by a large number of academics, and we're not attempting to intervene in the discourse. We're not telling people what they should do or how they should write about any specific issue. So we don't go in there saying, if you're in Georgia, you shouldn't write about issues relating to internally displaced people from, you know, from South Ossetia or from Abkhazia or something like that. We're not doing that kind of thing. In fact, quite the opposite. We're saying, right, okay, there are issues relating to internally displaced people. How do you deal with an issue about internally displaced people? What are the kind of issues or problems that might arise in reporting about that? And so does it start to look like propaganda, like a propaganda machine? No, I don't think so. I do think that it brings me to this fundamental problem, which is what I ended the talk on, which is I would much rather be in a situation where a piece of work like that had not been funded by a state, because you're going to get this kind of this pushback where people say, oh, but they would say that, wouldn't they? Or, well, that's just because the Germans want everybody to agree with their hegemonistic position on migration or whatever. But the problem with these kinds of things is that to produce a piece of work like that takes time and it costs money, and there isn't a lot that, I mean, and whoever pays for it, who else is going to pay for it? I mean, like, is it going to be from the Open Society Foundation? So you're going to then get accused of being in the pocket of Soros? You know, is it going to be from, you know, from business, in which case you're going to be accused of it coming from business? Is it going to come from some academic research program in the UK, in which case you're going to get told that you're being funded by the Boris administration or whatever it may be? There's no way that you can fund anything without falling into a position where people are going to start accusing you of bias as a result of your funding, which is a pain in the arse, but it's the reality of the universe, unfortunately.
I think those guidelines and the handbook that you worked on, unfortunately, they're not read much in media. I think, I mean, they exist. No, they do exist, but again, I mean, the way news production works, there's no time, you know it. So I think they exist, and it's important that one day some people sat down and decided that it was important that they exist, and there are many of them, as I said, or several, financed also by international organization. I mean, the IOM, the UNHCR have decided very quickly to intervene in media coverage. And, are the journalists going to listen to such institutions? No, but what I think, if we can come back on the, I mean, what researchers and media, how they could work together, I think to go further than, you know, telling journalists that they should know, well, sorry, I'll try to make it short. Increasing knowledge is important. And I think this is where researchers intervene. They help journalists write this kind of guidelines or handbooks because they know, because they work on it. They've been paid for years to work on this, and so researchers can increase knowledge to fight against false ideas or stereotypes, definitely. But there's something else that researchers are here for, and maybe I used the word complexity, and I said, ooh, people don't like complexity. But what people don't like is doubts. And I think this is definitely where researchers come in. I had never understood how much doubts were important before I worked on climate deniers. You see, in France, we don't call them climate deniers, we call them skeptics. They are not skeptics. Researchers are the skeptics. They are those who doubt. This is how science works. And this is where researchers can intervene by repeating, by trying to make us understand how doubts are important, but good doubts. I mean, with the methodology, you know, a scientific methodology, even if it's not hard science, as we call physics or whatever, but human science as well, and should be understood that it's not because 95% of the scientists only agree that it is not sure. And that, you know, so I think increasing knowledge is important, and those guidelines do have this kind of knowledge. Indeed, as you said, Rob, you know, no, there's not less work because migrants are numerous or etc. No, but definitely is understanding how society is complex, how things are complex, and how we should doubt. I have to say that using this word denier, we translate it in our book with négateur in French, with saying that they definitely are full of certainty. There is no doubt in those who say the migrants are like this, or climate change is not happening because of human, or it's not happening. This is the contrary of science. This is the total opposite. And I think scientists should be trained to come and say those things and explain the core of science again and again and again and again, if not the complexity of their science, but what is science and what are they doing in their labs, you know, and why it's important that they should exist and that the media should interview them all the time.
Can I quickly just, I think there's a really important point, which is about just setting the kind of baseline for what quality journalism looks like in a given situation, yeah? And I think that just so going back to what you began that little kind of that little vignette with was this point, which is I think legitimate, that not a lot of journalists will look at these kind of handbooks and guidebooks and what have you. But going back again as well to the idea of the role of academics in measuring or sort of like or guiding debate towards anything in particular, if we can set parameters for what we believe reasoned and quality debate looks like, if that can be set out in a guidebook, for example, this is what good migration reporting should look like, yeah, then that can be used to scrutinize what migration reporting actually happened. Because without something like that, we're ending up trying to scrutinize something based on our assessment of whether or not something's any good. But if you can actually look at something and say, here are some agreed principles, some basic things that are more than just the kind of like, we think you should not, you know, like just sort of, you know, be aware of the fact that the words you use matter in this kind of context, but actually to say, and here are a bunch of words that are problematic to use, and these are the reasons why. And yeah, you can use them, but you need to qualify why you're using them or whatever. You can then look at a piece of journalism and say, does this measure up to the principles, to the agreed principles for migration reporting that are set out in Rob McNeil's guidebook on reporting migration, for example, yeah? And by having that kind of thing in place, we can create a situation where we are better able to hold problematic practice within journalism to account which is really, really important. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is the role of work like this in training programs. Now, you were talking about the training, the Grande École and whatever in France, but generally speaking, I mean, most journalists that are working in the UK will have gone through like the NCTJ process or something along those lines. A lot of them will have undertaken a year-long degree in a year-long master's course in journalism or something along those lines before they move into the industry. And again, having a set of core principles for how to deal with certain subject matter is really valuable in informing those people who are then moving into the industry in the longer term. So I think that quite aside from the ongoing professional development where, yeah, it's true. I mean, how many people who are working in an industry will pick up a guidebook about how to do the thing they're already doing? That it's not going to happen that much, but it is useful for people moving into a new reporting on a new subject area. It is useful for people potentially getting set up for the industry, and then it provides this baseline set of analysis and content. A baseline set of ideas for how things should be done that can allow academics to scrutinize work in the future. And I think that that's a really valuable contribution of thing that Tom and I have done.
You mean like the IPCC guideline on climate change? Yeah.
Precisely. I mean,
the IPM, the International Panel on Migration and Asylum, is trying to do is to provide a list of certainties of researchers on migration and saying the researcher on migration internationally say that blah blah blah. That's what the IPCC provides now with but do you know that the IPCC didn't have a communications director before 12/11? So basically for how many years they didn't know how to communicate to the media as well. So I mean, it's really for the academic world to learn how to communicate simply knowledge to the media. It's different from those charters we're talking about where, you know, we're telling journalists, do not pay for a report, do not use hate speech, do not, that's what I mean. I mean, this is different, you know, who's going to read that? Who's going to need that? But if you want to provide information, solid information by researchers, yes, indeed, the researchers on migration do lack an international body, even though there is the European body that you have, that gives those direction and say, look, on this topic, now research is mostly certain, I don't know which scientific word you would use, that this and that, you know, that people mostly travel between African country and do not come to Europe. For example, this kind of facts, we can do a list of it. And this is one of the aim of the International Panel on Migration and Asylum, but unfortunately they lack financing. And you know, researchers work on that. I think Thomas Lacroix knows some of them, do not have time to work on this as much as they like. But that would be great, yeah.
So, but is it enough to communicate the facts? Given coming back to the things that Rob talked about just before about, you know, telling stories or telling partial bits of stuff in order to make it. I mean, let's look at so if you look at the standard image in climate science, and what's more effective? Is more effective to communicate the facts about scientific consensus, or is it more effective to post an image of a polar bear on an ice flake? Or is it more effective for when you're talking about migration to give the information that you have from the International Panel on Migration and Asylum, or to show a Turkish soldier with a 4-year-old dead boy on a beach? So I think, and I think we all know the answers to that question. Effective communication works through motion. So, but in these cases, I mean, it seems to me that in regard to these charters, the charters in many ways will end up being an obstacle to effective communication. So there's a real sort of conflict between ethics and rhetorics of efficient science communication that comes into play here. So I don't know how to navigate that particular. I don't know anything about migration studies, but I do know a little bit about how you navigate these things in terms of hard science communication. You know, that really seems to be one of the major issues, that you have this split between the rhetoric of what is efficient and the ethics of what is the right and correct way to communicate stuff.
That's why the media are so efficient if they want, because we use emotion a lot. We use emotion because we tell individual stories and with people who with witnesses, with people who testify of their stories. But what I teach my students in journalism, I say, you cannot stop there. You're not a journalist if you do that. If you just want to bring emotion, then you're not a journalist. You're here to make people understand things. And if you can, to make them think. And if you can, or if you want, because then this is a different step, to make them act. This is what NGOs tell you. That's how they work. With my brother, when we did the book on climate science and media, we met Yannick Jadot, who's now going to be candidate for presidency here, who was at the head of the world of Greenpeace. He said, first you move people with a polar bear, then you make them think. You've lost a lot of people meanwhile, and then you make them act, and you've lost a lot of other people. But move, think, act. So yes, so journalists are not here for people to act, even though they feel personally they want to see things change. I think you ask a lot of journalists, they in some topics, especially on migration, they want things to change. They want people to talk together. They want this world to be better, but they're not here to push people to act. I think we're here to move people through individual stories, to make people understand things. That's why we need researchers, because we need to understand the global image. We need to put things in context, but we still tell personal and individual stories, and we move people. So I think this is also where there is a gap, and also maybe there could be a bridge between researchers and journalists. You also interview people for your work, but many more people, and you anonymize them. You don't tell their name.
So I worry a little bit about the thing you said about doubt before, because one of the things that, and you're absolutely right. So scientists, they work within a sphere of doubt, but in relation to, especially to climate change, doubt is also a trigger of inaction, isn't it? It's very easy to latch onto doubt, especially in terms of climate change, but I think also in relation to issues like migration, is that if there remains a doubt, you do not act. It's what Segmentation calls an epistemological filibuster. Everything is just sort of put on hold or deferred until there is firm consensus about things. And if you communicate that scientists are still in doubt about scientific consensus, it's very easy to latch onto that, to say, well, then we won't do anything until there actually is.
Yeah, but you can push that and say, of course, we're never sure. What we have to accept is that we're never sure. What I mean by teaching to doubt is accepting that we are never sure. Even on science like physics or mathematics, we're never sure. So not to talk about human science on migrants, we're never sure, but it's okay. We're never sure, but it's okay. But we have to trust. And that's the word we haven't said yet, trust. We have to trust the one who knows. But, you know, that's one of the main problems. I said there is a problem with the power. We don't trust the politician because he lies. We don't trust the politician because he says he's going to do something and he doesn't do it. That's one of the problems on migration, actually. All our politicians say we're going to curb the figures down. And of course, they cannot curb the figures down because, as all researchers know, it's mainly students, or it's legal migration that is still the same, doesn't really change in our country. So anyway, I've lost myself. What did I want to say? I've lost myself there. I was starting something and I lost it. Oh yeah, so they don't trust us journalists, they don't trust the researcher, or they trust the researcher alone. One researcher, the polls in France show that the researcher, the person, is trusted by 80% of the people. But like the CNRS, the institution, is not trusted by many people. I forgot the figure. So the idea of the institution not being trusted anymore, like the teachers, you know, like the educational system, the political system, the media system, it's all seen as the same power that we don't want to follow anymore. We don't want to believe, we don't want to respect. So that's a wider problem, I think, than what we're talking about here on migration. Is we don't believe, we don't trust those who are supposed to know and those who are paid to know. As I always say, researchers are paid to do that. You know, we pay with public money in France, at least, for them to research for 30, 40 years on the same topic. So we should believe them. But no.
Thank you very much. I think we should end this discussion. It is extremely. I think we could carry on for hours. It's a very rich question, and I'm sure we can carry on this another context. But for now, I think we are good. So thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much, Catherine. It's been super interesting. And yeah, Mogens, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to both of you. It's been really marvelous. Yeah, learned an awful lot. So thank you very much.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for your invitation.
And the another webinar upcoming for the series?
No, I think we're done for this for now. So this year, there will be more next year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.